The morning sun cast its gentle warmth over the town as James stepped out of his modest home, adjusting his cap and making his way toward the factory. He was a middle-aged man with a solid build, the kind of man who knew the value of hard work. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. His boots echoed against the pavement as he walked down Main Street, lost in his thoughts. In front of him, a young black man, Samuel, struggled with a heavy cart loaded with boxes. Sweat dripped down his brow as he heaved the cart forward, its wheels squeaking under the weight. But despite his best efforts, the cart seemed to move slower with each step, as if the world itself was conspiring against him. James glanced around. People passed by without a second thought, some looking away deliberately, others muttering under their breath. There was a noticeable chill in the air when they saw Samuel, and yet, no one stopped to offer help. James, feeling uneasy but unable to ignore the sight, slowed his pace. He hesitated for a moment, wondering what the others would think. But then his hand instinctively reached out to help. "Can I give you a hand with that?" James asked, his voice unsure but genuine. Samuel looked up at the man before him. He had grown accustomed to the cruel glares, the whispers, the unspoken rules that told him he was less than the others. At first, he thought James was mocking him, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of kindness that made him pause. "I don't need no charity," Samuel said, his voice wary. "I'm not offering charity," James replied with a small smile. "Just trying to help." There was a long moment of silence, the weight of the world pressing in on both men. Finally, Samuel nodded reluctantly, stepping aside to let James assist with the cart. They walked side by side down the street, the weight of the boxes now shared between them. James could feel the stares of the townspeople, the discomfort hanging in the air. People whispered. Some shook their heads, others just stared in disbelief. "It's a hot one today," James remarked, attempting to break the awkward silence. Samuel said nothing, but his eyes softened slightly, the tension between them easing just a little. He hadn't expected this. In all his years working, he had learned to fend for himself, to endure, to never expect help. But here was a stranger, a white man, offering something that felt like kindness, a rarity in this town. As they reached the destination, a small store at the edge of town, Samuel turned to James. "Thanks," Samuel muttered, trying to sound nonchalant, though the gratitude was clear in his voice. James nodded, a quiet smile on his lips. "No problem." But as he turned to leave, he noticed the people gathered outside the store, watching them. The smile quickly faded from his face. He could hear the murmur of voices behind him. "What's he doing with that boy?" someone whispered, their words sharp as knives. Another voice added, "Doesn't he know what kind of trouble he's inviting?" James's steps faltered for a moment, the weight of their judgment settling on his shoulders. But he kept walking, not looking back. Later that day, Samuel pushed his cart to the local shop to make the delivery. The sign above the door read Harris's General Store, a place known for its no-nonsense approach and its owner's bitter views. James was passing by when he spotted Samuel unloading the crates from his cart. He didn't think twice this time. He stepped inside the store to speak with the shopkeeper, hoping to finish up his business quickly so he could head home. As he walked through the door, the bell above it jingled, and Samuel turned, surprised to see James once again. James offered a casual wave, a gesture of reassurance, but the shopkeeper, Mr. Harris, eyed him with a look of disapproval. "James," Mr. Harris greeted him coldly, his eyes narrowing as he noticed who James had just helped. "Ain't you got something better to do than hanging around with that boy?" James blinked, taken aback by the accusation, but he didn't respond. Instead, he approached the counter to pay for his supplies, trying to ignore the tension. "You know," Mr. Harris continued, his voice low and conspiratorial, "there are folks who might not take too kindly to you helping out like that." James remained silent, paying for his goods, and then turning to leave. He couldn't ignore the unspoken animosity in the air. As he stepped outside, he saw Samuel looking at him with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "You don't have to do that," Samuel said quietly, his voice rough with caution. "I wanted to help, James replied, his eyes serious. You don't have to carry that alone. Samuel's lips curled into a faint smile. Well, I appreciate it, but you won't win any friends around here doing that. James glanced back toward the store, noticing the people outside. Their stares seemed sharper now, colder. But he didn't flinch. He simply nodded. I'm not looking for friends, he said quietly, more to himself than to Samuel. I'm just trying to do what's right. The town square bustled with activity as the day moved on. James went about his business, but the weight of his earlier actions lingered. He was aware of the eyes that followed him, the judgment he could feel in the air, but he tried to keep his head down, focusing on the task at hand. But the whispering started again. This time, it was louder, more pointed. Did you see James today? Someone asked in a low voice, though their words carried through the crowd. Helping a black man with his cart. Like they're equals. Another voice, a woman's, joined in. It's disgusting. What's he thinking, associating with them like that? James felt the sting of their words. It was impossible to escape the harsh reality of the town's prejudices, no matter how hard he tried. The glances were like daggers, cutting into him from all directions. As he passed through the square, he noticed Thomas, the local shopkeeper, standing in the crowd. Thomas gave James a hard look, his lips curling into a sneer. James hesitated, unsure of what to do. But then Thomas caught his eye and spat on the ground in front of him. Disgusting, Thomas muttered loud enough for James to hear. James stood there, rooted to the spot. He wanted to respond, to argue, to stand his ground. But the words caught in his throat. The crowd was watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. Instead, he turned and walked away, head lowered, the weight of their scorn pressing heavily on his shoulders. The next morning, the factory buzzed with activity. James arrived early, ready for a long day of work, but the atmosphere inside the factory was thick with tension. His co-workers avoided his gaze, their eyes flicking nervously in his direction. He was no stranger to whispers behind his back, but today it felt different. The usual camaraderie that came with working together was gone, replaced by a cold, unspoken judgment. James, one of the older workers, called out, "You sure you want to be seen with that boy?" James froze in his tracks. His stomach tightened as he realized that the whispers from the street had followed him into the workplace. There was no escape, no place where he could be free from their judgment. "I was just helping him," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. One of the younger workers scoffed. "Helping him, huh? You've got a funny way of doing things, James. You're making us all look bad." The group of workers gathered around him, their voices growing louder. James felt their eyes boring into him, the weight of their scorn suffocating him. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice firm despite the fear creeping up his spine. "Don't come crying when they turn on you," one worker sneered. James swallowed hard, the pressure mounting. For the first time in his life, he felt the burden of the world pressing against him, the consequences of his small act of kindness weighing more heavily than he had ever anticipated. That evening, James came home to find his wife, Martha, pacing the living room. She looked at him with concern in her eyes, but there was an edge to her voice that made James uneasy. "I've been hearing things," Martha said, her voice low. "People are talking about you, James. About what you did today. Helping that man. Are you out of your mind?" "I was just trying to do the right thing," James said, trying to explain. "Right thing?" Martha echoed, her voice rising. "Do you realize what you've done? We've lived here for years. We have a family. You can't just go around helping people like that. Not here." James stepped forward, trying to calm her down. "Martha, it's not about them. It's about what's right." But Martha shook her head, her face pale with worry. "You don't understand. They'll come after you. After us." James paused, the weight of her words sinking in. His actions were not without consequences, and now he could feel the full force of it. The next day, James walked through the town again. This time, the eyes of the townspeople were harder, colder. He could hear the murmurs growing louder, the whispers more venomous. And yet, as he passed by the same corner where he had helped Samuel, he noticed the young man again, struggling with the same cart. This time, he was alone, carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Without thinking, James crossed the street and stepped toward him. "You need some help?" he asked softly. Samuel looked up, meeting James's eyes with a mix of surprise and gratitude. This time, he didn't hesitate. "Yeah," Samuel said quietly. "I could use a hand." James stepped forward, and together, the two of them pushed the cart down the street. The world around them seemed to disappear, leaving just the quiet hum of their steps. As James and Samuel walked down the street, the quiet between them was thick with unspoken thoughts. The street was busy, people moving in and out of shops, but it felt like the world had paused just for them. There was something in the air, a tension so palpable that neither man dared to speak too much. For James, it was as if he were standing on the edge of something deep, something important. He had never truly questioned the way things were in his small town before. It had always seemed so simple, the factory, his home, his family. But with every step he took beside Samuel, he felt the weight of something larger, something more profound than he had ever imagined. Samuel, too, was lost in his thoughts. He had been accustomed to doing everything on his own, surviving the daily injustices that came with being a black man in a town like this. His life had been about keeping his head down, doing his work, and going home without drawing attention to himself. And yet, here he was, walking alongside James, a man who should have been his enemy, offering him kindness instead. Samuel couldn't help but wonder if James truly understood the consequences of his actions, the risk that came with defying the norms of the town. Samuel had seen the way people looked at James. He had seen the sneers and the whispers. It wouldn't be long before it all came crashing down on him. Still, Samuel appreciated the gesture, even if it was just a small thing. It felt good, in a way, to be treated like a human being instead of an invisible laborer. James glanced at him out of the corner of his eye. "You sure you don't want me to help with the rest of that load?" Samuel shook his head, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. "You've done enough already, Mr. James." James smiled, though it was strained, his heart heavy with the realization that this small act of kindness might be the only thing he could offer, yet it felt so inadequate in the face of everything else. Later that day, as the sun began to set, James stood outside the local tavern, unsure of what to do next. He had spent the afternoon avoiding his co-workers at the factory, his thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and confusion. The pressure was mounting. Every glance from his neighbors felt like a judgment, a condemnation of the kindness he had shown Samuel. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he helped the young man, but he hadn't anticipated this level of backlash. It wasn't just the harsh looks, the whispered words, the rejection from his co-workers. It was the deep, unspoken understanding that in a town like this, helping someone who wasn't one of them was a crime in itself. James had worked hard his entire life to earn the respect of the people around him, but now, with every move he made, it felt like he was undoing all of it. He felt like an outsider in his own skin. As he stood there, a figure approached. It was Thomas, the local shopkeeper, with his arms crossed and a look of disapproval on his face. "Well, James, looks like you're making quite a name for yourself these days," Thomas said, his voice low and mocking. James sighed, his hand clenched into a fist by his side. "I'm just helping someone. What's the problem with that?" "Helping? With that boy?" Thomas's voice dripped with contempt. "You've gone soft, James. You've forgotten your place. You know what people are saying, right? You're making a fool of yourself." James was quiet for a moment, the weight of Thomas's words settling in. "I don't care what people think." Thomas shook his head, his face twisted in disgust. "You should. And if you don't, I'm telling you, you're going to regret it." The words stung, and for a moment, James felt himself faltering. He wanted to say something back, to argue, but the truth hung heavy in the air. There was no easy answer, no way to fix the wrongs of this town with one simple act of kindness. Thomas turned and walked away, leaving James standing there, feeling more isolated than ever before. That night, as James sat at the kitchen table with his wife, Martha, the silence between them was deafening. She hadn't said much since he came home, only exchanging brief words as she prepared dinner. Her eyes never met his, and James could feel the distance growing between them. The children were in bed by now, and it was just the two of them in the quiet house. James finally broke the silence. "Martha, I don't know what to do," he said, his voice heavy with the burden of everything that had happened. She set down the dish she was holding and turned to him, her expression softening but still filled with concern. "You know what's going to happen, don't you? You're going to lose everything. Your job, your friends, everything." James looked down at his hands. "I didn't do it for any of that. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Martha's voice was gentle but firm. "The right thing isn't always the smart thing, James. We've got a family to think about. People are talking. They're already starting to turn on you. I don't want to see you get hurt." James swallowed hard, the weight of her words hitting him like a ton of bricks. He had never seen his family in danger before, but now, it was as if everything he held dear was slipping through his fingers. He had tried to do something right, something kind, but it was becoming clear that in a town like this, that was a dangerous thing to do. "I don't know if I can go back to work tomorrow," James murmured. "I don't know if I can face them." Martha shook her head slowly. "I don't know what to tell you, James. All I know is that we've got to survive, and sometimes surviving means doing what everyone else does." James stared into the distance, his thoughts a storm of confusion. He had always tried to do the right thing, but now, the right thing felt impossible. The next morning, the factory seemed different to James. The air was thick with tension as soon as he stepped inside. The workers avoided his gaze, as though he were already a ghost among them. The whispers had only grown louder, more cutting. James could feel the weight of their eyes on him, judging him, condemning him for his actions. He hadn't realized how much the opinions of others had shaped his life until now, but standing in that factory, he realized that his small act of kindness had made him an enemy in his own town. As he made his way to his workstation, one of his co-workers, Billy, called out to him. "Hey, James," Billy said, trying to keep his voice light but failing. "You don't really want to go down that road, do you?" James didn't answer at first. He wasn't sure what to say. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, all spinning around the question. "What's the right thing to do now?" Billy took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You've got to stop, James. It's not too late to back out. People are already talking. And when they start talking like that, it never ends well." James turned to face him, his jaw set with determination. "I can't back out now, Billy. I can't live with myself if I do." Billy shook his head, looking both sympathetic and fearful. "You're making a mistake." But as James walked away, the truth of what Billy said hit him like a cold slap. He didn't know if he was making a mistake, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stop now. He had crossed the line, and there was no going back. The weight of the decision settled on his shoulders, heavy and suffocating. But James knew he had to stand firm. He couldn't let fear dictate his actions. He had to be brave. And so, as the day continued, James knew that he had made a dangerous decision. But in his heart, he also knew it was the only decision he could make. The evening was unusually warm for a late spring night, and the people of the town gathered in the town hall for their monthly meeting. The building was packed with familiar faces, each one a reflection of the town's history, its traditions, and its biases. James arrived early, hoping to slip in unnoticed, but the moment he stepped through the door, a cold hush fell over the room. Whispers followed him like a shadow as he took his seat in the back. No one said anything outright, but James could feel the tension building in the air. He tried to keep his head down, but his presence was impossible to ignore. And as soon as the meeting began, the town leader, Mr. Harris, stood up to address the crowd, his voice booming across the room. "We've had a good run here in this town," Mr. Harris began, his tone jovial. "But lately, things have been changing. We've got folks doing things they shouldn't be doing, putting ideas in people's heads that don't belong in this town." James's heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly what Mr. Harris was referring to. All eyes in the room shifted toward him, and the subtle, collective judgment was unmistakable. "You know, helping people's all well and good," Mr. Harris continued, his voice growing more sinister. "But we have to remember what makes this town what it is. We keep our ways, And we don't let outsiders and strangers come in and make us forget who we are. The crowd nodded in agreement, murmuring their support. James could feel his chest tighten. It was clear that Mr. Harris was talking about him and Samuel. The feeling of isolation grew stronger, and James's hand clenched at his side. Mr. Harris's gaze swept the room. I just think it's time we all remembered that kindness, while it's fine in small doses, shouldn't go too far. We don't want to become something we're not. James stood up, his body tense, his voice rising in the silence of the room. I helped a man who needed it, James said, his voice steady despite the overwhelming pressure. And if that's wrong, then I'll gladly be wrong. But I won't apologize for doing what's right. The room fell deathly quiet. The townsfolk exchanged glances, some with disgust, others with confusion, but no one spoke. James could feel every eye on him, and for a moment, he thought he might be swallowed whole by the silence. Finally, Mr. Harris's voice broke through the stillness. Well, we'll see how long you stand by that, James. The town doesn't take kindly to people who forget their place. James stood his ground, but his stomach churned with dread. This battle was just beginning, and he wasn't sure how long he could hold on. The next day, the factory buzzed with activity, but James could feel the difference. His co-workers, once friendly and familiar, now avoided him. There was a coldness in the air, a palpable distance that made it impossible to pretend everything was normal. He picked up his tools and began his work, but the weight of the stairs was more oppressive than the heat in the factory. Every time he glanced up, someone quickly turned away. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to focus on the task at hand, but he couldn't escape the oppressive silence. Billy, the young man who had warned him the day before, approached cautiously. You still don't get it, do you? Billy whispered, his eyes darting around nervously. This town is all about tradition. You can't just go around trying to change things, not without consequences. James looked at Billy, his jaw clenched. I don't need to change anything. I just helped someone who needed it. Billy sighed, his expression filled with pity. You've got a good heart, James, but it doesn't work that way here. You've gone too far. James's breath caught in his throat. I didn't go too far. What's wrong with treating people like people? Billy didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at the other workers, who had been quietly gathering nearby, their murmurs growing louder. The tension in the air was palpable. One of the older men, Charlie, spoke up. You're making a big mistake, James. Helping people who aren't like us? You can't do that here. It's not how things work. And we don't take kindly to people who go around stirring up trouble. James opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Charlie's tone was final, and the other workers nodded in agreement. The factory was no longer a place where he could simply work and go home. It was a battlefield, and he was on the losing side. As the day dragged on, James felt more and more like a stranger in his own life. The weight of the disapproval and the isolation grew heavier with every passing minute. That evening, James stood outside the factory, exhausted, his mind reeling from the encounter. He had always worked hard, tried to keep his head down, and do what was expected of him. But now, everything had changed. He could no longer ignore the undercurrent of hostility that had grown between him and his town. He looked up and saw Samuel across the street, standing at the edge of the sidewalk. Samuel's presence was a reminder of everything James had done and everything that was at stake. James crossed the street to meet him, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. Samuel didn't smile when he saw James, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that James couldn't quite place. I heard what happened at the town hall, Samuel said, his voice low. People are talking, James. I didn't do anything wrong, James replied, his voice sharp, defensive. I helped you. That's all. Samuel nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I appreciate it, but you don't understand what you've done. They won't forget it, James. They won't forgive you for it. James's heart sank. I can't just stand by and do nothing. I know, Samuel said quietly, but sometimes, standing up for what's right comes with a cost. James clenched his fists, the tension rising in his chest. I'm not backing down. I can't. Samuel looked at him, a hint of sadness in his eyes. Then you're going to have to live with the consequences. And so will I. James swallowed hard, the weight of his decision pressing on him like an anvil. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. That night, when James arrived home, Martha was waiting for him, her arms crossed, her face drawn with worry. "I heard what happened at the factory," she said, her voice trembling. "I heard about what happened at the town hall. What is going on, James?" James set down his jacket, his mind already weary from the day's events. I had to help him. I had to do something." Martha's eyes filled with frustration. "But you didn't just help him, James. You're making a stand. And now it's affecting all of us. The kids are hearing things. People are talking. I don't care about what they're saying," James replied, his voice rising. "I can't just turn my back on what's right." Martha's face hardened. "And I can't turn my back on our family. James, you're putting us all in danger. You're putting everything at risk." James was silent, his chest tight. He had always tried to provide for his family, to do what was best for them. But now, it felt like he was losing everything in the pursuit of what was right. "I'm not backing down," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Martha's eyes welled with tears. "Then you're on your own, James. I can't do this anymore." James's heart broke as he watched her walk away, the weight of his choices settling like a stone in his stomach. He had made his stand, but at what cost? The next morning, as James walked through the streets of the town, he could feel the eyes on him. It was as if the whole town had turned against him, each glance a reminder of the price he was paying for his actions. When he reached the corner near the factory, he saw Mr. Harris standing by the storefront, talking to a group of men. The moment he saw James, his smile was thin, full of mockery. "So, you've decided to keep going with this nonsense, huh?" Mr. Harris said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're making a fool of yourself, James." James didn't answer. He just stood there, facing Mr. Harris and the others, his heart racing. The confrontation he had been avoiding was now unavoidable. "Listen, James," Mr. Harris continued, "you've made your point, but you've crossed a line. And I'm not the only one who feels this way. If you don't back down, you'll find out just how far people are willing to go to make sure things stay the way they are." James took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly. "I've made my choice, Mr. Harris. I'm not backing down." The tension was thick in the air, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire town had come to a standstill. But James stood firm, ready to face whatever came next. Later that day, as James walked home, he couldn't shake the feeling of impending change. His decision had already cost him so much. His family, his friends, his peace of mind. But as he walked, he saw Samuel again. This time, Samuel wasn't alone. He was talking to a few other black men, sharing quiet words, and they all seemed to be waiting for something. When Samuel saw James, he gave him a small nod. "You're not the only one making a stand, James. It's gonna be a fight, but we'll get through it together." James wasn't sure what he expected, but hearing those words, hearing the quiet strength in Samuel's voice, gave him the courage to keep moving forward. As they stood there, the weight of everything ahead seemed just a little lighter. Together, they would face the consequences. And maybe, just maybe, they would change the town forever. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the town as the streets began to empty. James walked through the town square, his steps heavy, knowing the eyes of the townspeople were on him once again. They watched him with thinly veiled contempt, their murmurs barely audible but biting. He had walked this same path countless times before, but today, it felt different. Today, the space between him and the rest of the town was impossible to ignore. The whispers had grown louder, and the judgment was palpable. No one spoke to him, and yet, everyone had something to say about him. As he passed the bakery, Mrs. Thompson, a woman he had known since childhood, turned her back on him, her face hard and cold. He could feel the sting of her rejection like a slap. His heart sank, but he kept walking, determined not to let it show. In the distance, he saw Mr. Harris talking to a small group of men near the general store. The conversation stopped when they saw James approaching, their eyes narrowing in unison. Well, look who it is, Mr. Harris called out, his voice dripping with venom. The town's savior. The man who thinks he can change everything. James stopped in his tracks, meeting Mr. Harris's gaze. I'm not trying to change anything. I'm just trying to do what's right. Mr. Harris smirked, stepping closer. You know, James, you've been a real disappointment. Helping them, making us all look weak. You've got a lot of folks here upset, and I'm starting to think you've made a real mistake. The group of men behind Mr. Harris muttered their agreement, and James could see their fists clenching. The air was thick with hostility. James felt the anger rise in his chest. If standing up for what's right makes me a mistake, then so be it. But I'm not going to apologize for it. The group laughed derisively, but Mr. Harris's voice cut through the laughter. This town has rules, James. You're either part of it or you're not. And I'm afraid you're not. The words landed hard, and James could feel the weight of them. But he didn't flinch. He wasn't about to back down. The next day, James arrived at the factory early, his thoughts racing. He knew that things would only get worse, but nothing had prepared him for the cold silence that awaited him inside. The factory was a place of gruff camaraderie, a place where the workers usually greeted each other with gruff jokes or nods of acknowledgement. But today, there was nothing. As James walked past the rows of workers, no one looked up. It was as if he was invisible, or worse, a pariah. Billy, who had once been friendly, avoided eye contact. Charlie, the older worker who had warned him before, turned his back without a word. The air was thick with tension, and James could feel it in his bones. He approached his workstation slowly, his chest tight. As he reached the assembly line, he caught the eye of one of his co-workers, Jake, who had always been a bit of a troublemaker. Jake's lips curled into a sneer. Think you're some kind of hero, huh? Jake muttered under his breath. You're just a fool. A fool who's going to lose everything. You really think they're going to let you change things around here? Think again, James. James opened his mouth to reply, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't realized how much his actions had affected the people he worked with. The truth was, he had expected more understanding. He hadn't expected to lose his place in the community this quickly. With a deep breath, he turned back to his work, trying to focus, but the hum of the factory, once so familiar and comforting, now felt like an oppressive reminder of the growing divide between him and the town. That night, James sat at the kitchen table, his head resting in his hands. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on him. The town was turning against him. His co-workers were shunning him, and his own family was feeling the strain. Martha stood in the kitchen, her back to him as she prepared dinner. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. She had been quiet all evening, her face drawn with concern, but there was a tightness in her shoulders that made James feel like a stranger in his own home. Martha, he started, but she cut him off before he could finish. You've made your decision, James, and now, we're all paying for it, she said, her voice laced with frustration. The kids have been hearing things at school. They're asking questions I can't answer. James stood up, walking toward her. I'm not doing this to hurt anyone. I'm trying to do what's right. Martha turned to face him, her eyes welling with tears. You don't understand. The right thing isn't always the easy thing. You've put us all in a position we can't get out of. You don't know what it's like to be stared at, judged, and whispered about every day. You don't know how it feels to have everything we've built threatened by your actions. I'm trying to make the world a better place, Martha. I can't stand by and do nothing when I know what's wrong. She shook her head, tears slipping down her face. And I can't watch you destroy everything we have. James opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He had never felt so torn, so lost. Martha's pain was real, and he couldn't ignore it. But neither could he ignore what was in his heart. I don't know how to fix this, Martha, he said softly, his voice breaking, but I can't go back. I can't pretend I didn't do what I thought was right. Martha's shoulders trembled, and she wiped her tears away, though she didn't say anything more. The room felt colder, and the space between them grew wider. The next day, James found Samuel waiting for him near the factory. Samuel's face was serious. and there was an edge of sadness in his eyes as James approached. "You don't look so good," Samuel remarked, his voice low. "I'm not doing so well, to be honest," James replied. "Everything's falling apart. The factory's turning against me. My own family's on the edge." Samuel nodded, his expression one of understanding. "I told you it wouldn't be easy, but you didn't listen." James sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't think it would be like this. I didn't think it would be this hard." Samuel stepped closer, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "Doing the right thing never is, but you've made your choice. Now you have to stand by it, no matter what comes next." James looked at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can do this anymore. I don't know if I can stand up against all this hate." Samuel's voice softened. "You're not standing alone. Not anymore." James met his gaze, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. Samuel was right. He wasn't alone. As long as he had people like Samuel by his side, he could keep fighting. "I can't back down now," James said, his voice firmer than it had been all week. "I've come too far." Samuel smiled faintly, giving him a nod of solidarity. "Then let's fight together." Later that afternoon, James found himself back in the town square, his mind still reeling from the confrontations and the weight of everything that had happened. But something had changed within him. He could no longer just wait for things to change on their own. If he wanted to make a difference, he had to take action. He walked toward the general store where Mr. Harris was talking to a few other men, their heads lowered in quiet conversation. As soon as they saw James approaching, the chatter stopped, and the group turned to face him, their expressions filled with disdain. James walked up to Mr. Harris, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not backing down, and I'm going to make sure people know what you're really about. The hate you're spreading isn't welcome here anymore." Mr. Harris sneered. "You don't get it, do you, James? You're fighting a losing battle." James didn't flinch. "Maybe I am, but at least I'm fighting for something worth believing in." The group of men exchanged uncertain glances, but no one spoke. James stood there, unwavering. He had made his decision, and he wasn't going to let fear stop him. As the days went on, James found that there were others who shared his vision. Samuel wasn't the only one who supported him. Slowly, whispers of solidarity began to spread. A few people from the factory, people who had once been silent, now approached James with quiet words of encouragement. It was clear that the tide was starting to turn. The battle wasn't over, but James had made the first move. And now, the fight for change had truly begun. The atmosphere in town had become even more charged, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Every morning, as James walked down the street, he felt the growing divide between himself and everyone else. It wasn't just the workers at the factory who avoided him now. It was the entire town. The whispers followed him everywhere he went. People avoided eye contact, children stared at him in confusion, and the once friendly shopkeepers now looked away when he walked in. James entered the local diner for breakfast, his stomach tight with anxiety. He had learned to ignore the stares, but they still stung. As he sat down at a booth, the waitress, Margie, gave him a quick, cold glance. She didn't say anything but set his coffee cup down with a clink, too forceful to be accidental. "Just the usual?" she asked, her voice flat. "Yeah," James said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. He looked out the window, watching the townsfolk walk by. It used to feel like home. Now, it felt like a foreign place, filled with strangers who all shared a common sentiment, that he didn't belong. As Margie walked away, James heard the unmistakable sound of murmurs from the counter. A group of men, regulars at the diner, were talking in low voices, but he could hear their every word. "James and his new friend, huh?" one of them scoffed. "Should have known better," another man grumbled. "It's just like them to ruin everything." James took a deep breath and turned back to his coffee. He couldn't let their words shake him, but it was getting harder to ignore. At the factory, the tension was palpable. The workers were quieter than usual, their silence hanging heavily in the air. James felt every pair of eyes on him as he entered the building. The usual gruff greetings were gone, replaced by the cold, unfriendly silence. Charlie, the older worker who had spoken to him before, finally approached him during lunch break. He seemed reluctant, his words hesitant. James, you've got to stop, Charlie said, lowering his voice so no one else could hear. You're making things harder for everyone. We've been here a long time, and this town, this place, it doesn't change. James clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to lash out. He had heard this before. I can't just sit by and watch things stay the way they are, James replied, his voice firm. It's not right. It's not the way things should be. Charlie sighed, looking around nervously to make sure no one was listening. You're going to get yourself hurt, James. Maybe worse. I'm not afraid, James said, though the fear gnawed at him, buried deep within. I can't keep living like this, pretending everything is okay when I know it's not. Charlie gave him a sad, resigned look. Then you're on your own, kid. I don't know how much longer any of us can stand by you. James stared at Charlie, his heart sinking. He had always thought of Charlie as a mentor, someone who had been through hard times and come out stronger. But now, Charlie's words felt like a warning. The lunch bell rang, signaling the end of break, and Charlie walked away without another word. James watched him go, feeling the weight of his isolation settle deeper inside him. James returned home that evening, feeling defeated before he even stepped through the door. The house was eerily quiet, and he found Martha sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded in front of her. She didn't look up when he walked in. Is everything all right? James asked, his voice uncertain. Martha sighed, finally meeting his gaze. No, James. Things are not all right. The kids came home today, asking why people don't talk to us anymore. Why their classmates are calling them names because of what you've done. James swallowed hard. He had feared this moment, feared the ripple effects his actions would have on his children. Martha, I never wanted them to go through this, but I can't go back. I did what I thought was right. Martha's eyes flashed with frustration. Right? What's right about this, James? We're losing everything because of one decision you made. You're not just hurting yourself, you're hurting us. I know, James said, his voice breaking, but I can't live with myself if I do nothing. Martha shook her head, her face pale with worry. Maybe you're right, but I'm not sure I can keep going like this. I don't know what else I can say to you, James. I'm scared. James stood there, the weight of her words pressing on him. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to stay with me through this. I don't know if I can, Martha whispered, tears welling in her eyes. James's heart cracked at the sound of her voice. The rift between them felt like an abyss, and no matter how much he wanted to bridge the gap, he didn't know how. The following morning, as James made his way to the factory, he was met with a sight that made his stomach drop. A large group of workers stood outside, blocking the entrance. Their faces were grim, their eyes cold. As James approached, Mr. Harris stepped forward, his expression one of thinly veiled anger. This is the last chance, James, Mr. Harris said, his voice low. You've caused enough trouble for this town, for the factory, for all of us. If you don't stop helping those people, I'll make sure you're out of here. We'll make sure of it. James's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood firm. I'm not backing down, Mr. Harris. I'm not going to be intimidated. We'll see about that, Mr. Harris replied. We've made our decision. You're on your own now. The workers parted, and James was left standing there, unsure of what to do. The factory was no longer a place where he felt welcome. It had become a battleground, and he had already lost. That evening, after another grueling day at work, James returned home to find a note on his doorstep. It was a simple message, written in block letters. You're making a mistake, James. Stay out of this, or we'll make sure it's the last mistake you ever make. James stared at the note, his heart racing. He had expected backlash, but this was different. This wasn't just the cold stares and whispered words anymore. This was a direct threat. He knew the people in this town. They weren't the type to make idle threats. The fear that had been building inside him for weeks now came rushing to the surface. He had put everything on the line, and the stakes had just gotten higher. He walked inside, the note still clutched in his hand, and Martha looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for answers. What's wrong, James? She asked. James opened his mouth, but no words came out. How could he explain the depth of the danger now? How could he tell her that they were no longer just isolated, whispered judgments? This was real. The consequences were here. I don't know if I can keep going like this, James whispered. Martha stood up, her face filled with concern. James, this isn't just about you anymore. It's about all of us. He nodded, the reality of it settling in like a weight in his chest. He had come so far, and now, the consequences were becoming too heavy to bear. The next day, as James made his way to the factory, the tension in the air was unbearable. He could feel the eyes of the workers on him as he walked through the door. There was no turning back now. He reached his workstation, but before he could start his shift, Mr. Harris and a few others approached him. Pack your things, Mr. Harris said, his voice cold. You done here, James? You're a liability to this factory. A liability to all of us. James stared at Mr. Harris, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. It wasn't just the factory anymore. It was everything. His job, his town, his family. The decision had been made for him. He swallowed the lump in his throat. I'm not leaving. I'll fight this. Mr. Harris's expression hardened. You won't be able to. And don't think the rest of the town won't know why you're really leaving. No one's going to protect you now. As James walked away from the factory for the last time, the truth finally hit him. The fight had only just begun. But this was a fight he was ready for. He couldn't turn back. Not now. The days following James's departure from the factory were a blur. He spent his time trying to figure out what to do next. But the walls around him seemed to be closing in. The town had turned against him. His family was at breaking point, and even his once solid resolve was starting to crack. Every corner of his life felt like it was falling apart, and it was hard to tell where the end was. It was late in the evening when Samuel found him again. He knocked on James's door, and when James opened it, Samuel's face was grim. We need to talk, Samuel said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His eyes were hard, but there was something else behind them, something like determination. James motioned for him to sit. What is it? I'm not sure I can take much more right now. Samuel glanced at the empty chair, then sat across from him. You've done something big, James. You're not just fighting for you anymore. You're fighting for everyone like me, and for everyone who doesn't have a voice. James rubbed his face, weariness flooding his body. I know, but I can't even get a job now. No one will even look at me. They've taken everything from me. I know, Samuel said quietly. That's why we need to do something about it. This town, this factory, they won't stop until we've lost everything. But we're not alone. James looked up at him, his mind racing. What are you saying? I'm saying that we can't fight this battle one person at a time. It's going to take everyone, James. You've already made the first move. But now, we need to make it bigger. We need to show the town that we won't stand down. You have a voice, and it's not just yours anymore. James sat back in his chair, his heart beating faster. You want me to organize something? A protest? Samuel nodded. Exactly. We've got to make our voices heard. And we need you, James. You've already done the hard part. James's throat tightened, but a spark of determination flickered within him. This is going to get ugly, isn't it? Samuel's eyes met his. Yeah, but it's the only way. James leaned forward, finally meeting Samuel's gaze. Then let's do it. The following days were filled with planning, organizing, and quiet conversations. James and Samuel worked together to rally those who had been too afraid to speak out. Slowly, they gathered a small but growing group of supporters, people from all walks of life who had been quietly watching James's fight from the sidelines. One evening, Samuel introduced James to a local teacher, Mrs. Williams, who had been teaching in the town for years. She was in her late 50s, with a calm demeanor that hid a fierce spirit. She had watched the racial divisions in the town grow over time, but had kept her head down. Now, she was ready to fight back. We can't sit quietly anymore, Mrs. Williams said when they sat down to talk. Our children are watching us. If we don't stand up for what's right, they'll think this is how the world works. This is our chance to make a difference. James nodded, the weight of her words settling in. He had been fighting this battle alone for so long. But now he felt something else, something stronger. The movement was growing, and he wasn't alone anymore. Over the next few days, the group met in secret, preparing for the protest. Posters were made, leaflets were printed, and word spread. Every day, more people joined their cause. But the townspeople who opposed them were growing louder, and so were the threats. The air in the town was charged with fear and anticipation. James had never felt more nervous, but also more determined. The protest was their chance to show that their voices mattered, and that they wouldn't back down. The day of the protest arrived, and the town square was more crowded than ever. James stood in the front of the crowd, Samuel beside him, as people from all parts of the town gathered in solidarity. The signs were simple but powerful: equality for all, justice now, and end the silence. As the crowd began to grow, so did the tension. James could feel the eyes of the townspeople on him, watching, waiting for the protest to falter. But he stood tall, his heart racing with nervous energy. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a group of men moving toward them. Mr. Harris leading them, followed by some of the factory workers, including Charlie. Their faces were filled with anger, and they carried their own signs. Signs that read, "Go home," and "Keep this town white." The protesters, despite their fear, held their ground. The standoff was inevitable. Mr. Harris shouted across the square, his voice filled with venom. "You're making a fool of yourself, James. You don't belong here. You and your people need to go back where you came from." James stood firm, his voice unwavering. "We're not going anywhere. We belong here, just like you." The crowd was silent, waiting for the next move. Then, without warning, one of Mr. Harris's men stepped forward and shoved James. The crowd gasped. "Stay out of this," the man yelled. But James didn't back down. Instead, he pushed back, standing tall. "I'm not afraid of you. I've come too far to stop now." At that moment, someone in the crowd shouted, "Stand with James!" And it was like a switch had been flipped. People started shouting, pushing back, and the protest erupted into a powerful chorus of voices. The police arrived soon after, trying to break up the crowd. But the protesters held strong, their voices louder than the threat of violence. The protest continued well into the afternoon. And while they were able to make their voices heard, the costs were immediate and harsh. By the end of the day, several of the protesters had been arrested, including James. He was taken away in handcuffs, his face bruised from the scuffle, but his spirit unbroken. Martha was at the police station when James was brought in. Her face was pale with worry, but there was something else in her eyes, something like understanding. "You did what you had to do, didn't you?" she said quietly, her voice trembling as she reached out to touch his face. "I thought I was going to lose you." James nodded, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to hurt anyone. But this was the only way to make a change." Martha looked at him, her tears brimming with conflicting emotions: relief, anger, fear. "I don't know what the future holds, James, but I see now that this fight isn't just about us. It's about everyone who's been silenced. And I'm with you. I'll stay with you." James's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and guilt. He had taken so much from her, but now, for the first time, he felt the strength of their bond. No matter what happened next, they were in this together. The days following the protest were filled with uncertainty. James was released from jail, but the charges were far from dropped. The protest had ignited a fire in the town, but it was a fire that had yet to be put out. The town was divided. Some rallied around James and the cause for change, while others doubled down in their resistance. As James walked through the town square one afternoon, he noticed a small group of supporters standing outside the diner, quietly holding up their sides. Among them was Mrs. Williams, the teacher, and a few of the factory workers who had once avoided him. Despite the division, the small but growing group of supporters made their presence known. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Samuel said beside him, watching the crowd with quiet pride. "But it's happening, James. Little by little, it's happening." James nodded, his heart full of both hope and fear. The battle was far from over, but it had begun. And for the first time, he believed that change was possible. Days passed after the protest, and the town seemed to be split more than ever. The streets were quieter, But there was a palpable tension in the air, one that weighed down on everyone, whether they supported James or not. Despite the arrests, despite the threats, there was a quiet resilience among the people who had stood by James. They weren't backing down. James didn't know what the future held, but he could feel a shift, an energy in the air that hadn't been there before. It was as if the town had woken up, whether it wanted to or not. James and Samuel stood outside the old church on the edge of town, watching the crowd that had gathered for a community meeting. The church, once a place of solace for most, was now a place of reckoning. The building was packed with townspeople, some there to support the cause, others to denounce it. "This is it," Samuel said quietly, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This is where it all comes to a head. We either make a change, or we go back to the way things were." James nodded, his mind racing. The weight of the moment settled on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long while, he felt sure of one thing. They had already started something they couldn't stop. The protest had been the spark, but now, the fire was spreading. Inside the church, the meeting began. The local clergy, usually a quiet figure in the town's life, stood at the pulpit, his voice steady but grave. "We're here to talk about what has happened to this town. What we've become," the preacher said, his voice carrying the weight of the years. "And we need to decide, are we a town that stands for justice? Or are we a town that stands for hatred?" James stood in the back of the room, surrounded by his supporters. People who had begun to speak out, to push against the long-standing norms. They were few in number, but their presence was loud. He saw familiar faces, some he had known for years, and others who were strangers, drawn to this moment by the pull of change. The preacher's words rang through the church like a bell, reverberating through the crowd. "If we do not make the hard decisions now, we will continue to live in a town that denies the dignity of every human being. This is not the town I want for my children, and I believe it is not the town you want either." The silence that followed was thick, and for a brief moment, James thought that nothing would change. But then, one by one, a few brave souls began to stand. They spoke up, voicing their support for James, for the movement, for the belief that every person deserved respect. It wasn't a perfect victory. There was still plenty who shouted their dissent, their hatred. But James knew that this moment, this small shift, was a victory in itself. The conversation had started. The following weeks saw the town's divisions laid bare. James could feel it every time he left the house. Whispers behind his back, glares from people who once called him a friend, and families torn apart by differing opinions. Martha remained by his side, but it was clear that the strain was wearing on her. She had stood with him, but she couldn't help but feel the pain of what their family was going through. The tension at home was palpable. One evening, James returned from a long day of organizing a meeting in the town square. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Martha was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes distant. "I don't know how much longer I can take this, James," Martha said softly, her voice heavy with concern. "The kids are being called names at school, and I can't protect them from it anymore. The whole town is turning against us." James closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words. He had known that standing up for what was right would come with consequences, but the reality of it was something else entirely. He had sacrificed his job, his reputation, and now his family was paying the price. "I didn't ask for any of this, Martha," James said quietly, "but I couldn't sit by and do nothing. I couldn't be a part of something that hurt people, that made them feel less than human." Martha's expression softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I know, but what if we lose everything? What if the kids grow up in a town that doesn't want them, in a world that doesn't care about them?" James sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. I've never been more certain about anything in my life. This is worth fighting for." Martha didn't answer immediately. She squeezed his hand, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to find the hope that had once been there. Finally, she nodded, though it was clear that the fear was still in her heart. "I don't know how we'll get through this, but I'll stand by you. I won't walk away. I just wish there was a way to make this easier." James smiled faintly, his heart heavy with the burden of her uncertainty. "We'll figure it out together." It didn't take long for the other side to organize. Mr. Harris and the other opposition leaders began to rally their supporters, holding meetings and spreading fear throughout the town. Their message was simple. James and his group were trying to destroy the town's way of life. They spread rumors about the protests being violent, about outsiders coming into town to stir up trouble. One day, James was walking through the square when he saw a crowd gathered near the factory. Mr. Harris was speaking to a group of angry men, his words loud and sharp. "This town was built on hard work and tradition. We don't need outsiders telling us what's right," Mr. Harris shouted. "James Peterson and his people are trying to tear this town apart. They're the real threat, and we won't let them destroy what we've built." The crowd cheered in agreement, their faces twisted with anger. James could feel the hate directed at him, but he didn't flinch. He had known this was coming, but seeing it firsthand still hit him like a punch to the gut. As he approached the crowd, he saw Charlie, his old friend, his mentor, standing near the front. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the years of friendship seemed to stand between them, an impossible chasm that couldn't be crossed. "Charlie," James called, his voice firm but calm, "you don't have to do this. You don't have to stand with them." Charlie looked at him, his expression unreadable. Then, he shook his head. "You've gone too far, James. You've brought this on yourself. And now you've got all of us paying for it." James's heart ached as he looked at Charlie, but he didn't back down. "I didn't want any of this, but I'm not going to stop, and neither should you." But Charlie didn't say anything more. He just turned his back and walked away, leaving James standing there, feeling the sting of his words. Despite the organized opposition, there was a quiet group of people who had been watching from the sidelines. They didn't speak up in the meetings, didn't wave the signs in the streets, but they were there. People who had always believed in justice and equality, but had been too afraid to say anything. In the weeks following the protest, more of them began to speak out. The change was slow at first, a whisper here and there, but eventually, it grew louder. People began to show up at town meetings, not as vocal supporters, but as a silent majority who had finally found the courage to speak up. One evening, Mrs. Williams, the teacher, gathered some of the more hesitant townsfolk in the back of the town library. "You don't have to fight in the front lines," she said, "but your silence gives them power. If you want things to change, if you want our town to be better, you have to speak up. You have to show that we will not stand by and let hate take hold of this place." The small group nodded in agreement, some with fear in their eyes, but others with a flicker of determination. They weren't going to let the loudest voices drown out the truth. James stood in the square one afternoon, looking out at the people who had gathered. The movement was still small, but it was growing. The town was changing, even if it was only in the hearts and minds of a few. The path ahead was still unclear, but James knew one thing. They were no longer alone, and that made all the difference. As the crowd began to chant, James raised his hand, the crowd silencing instantly. He spoke, his voice filled with conviction, as the words of his speech rang out through the town. "This isn't just about me. This is about all of us. This is about a town that we can be proud of. A town where no one is treated like they don't belong. This is just the beginning, and together, we'll make sure it's the future we deserve." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices loud and united. For the first time in a long while, James felt a spark of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could make the change they had fought so hard for.